Welcome to episode 52 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerri Williams. I'm a retired agent writing crime fiction inspired by actual FBI cases. In this episode, we speak with Myron Fuller. Myron served in the FBI for 30 years. He is interviewed about his case agent and undercover role in the case codenamed ABSCAM, originally initiated to investigate and penetrate white-collar crime and organized crime targets in the New York area. Specifically, it was begun as an undercover operation to infiltrate the conspiracy of members of organized crime to purchase a mortgage company for fraudulent and criminal purposes. The sophisticated ABSCAM scenario included a fictitious, wealthy Lebanese businessman and a $7 million bank account. Myron Fuller and his undercover partner, Agent John Hauss, represented that they had worked for a consortium of foreign banks and the Arab businessman who wanted to funnel millions of Middle East money into ventures in the United States. The scenario, with the cooperation of conman Mel Weinberg, allowed for the successful conviction of organized crime figures, conmen, and ultimately corrupt politicians. Myron Fuller retired as the special agent in charge of the Honolulu Division. When it was suggested that I reach out to Myron to talk with him about ABSCAM, I was still under the impression that ABSCAM had always been a public corruption case. So when I spoke with Myron, I was surprised to find out that the original targets were the New York mob families. So we'll get into that interview in just a bit. But before we do, I just want you to know that Pay to Play, my crime novel about a female FBI agent investigating corruption in the Philadelphia strip club industry, continues to do well. I have 45 reviews, and I want you to know that I've been told, don't know if this is true, that when you get to 50 reviews on Amazon, some type of algorithm kicks in and they promote the book more. So if you've read the book and you enjoyed it, I really would appreciate it if you would go over to Amazon and give it a review. Here are 3 that came in since the last time we spoke. This first one is from Pat Brogan, and Pat says, "What a great story. Jerri's experience as an FBI agent gave her rich fodder for the novel. I kept wondering how much was based on real cases. She writes so well that I didn't want to put the book down. At first, I thought that Jerri was a man because of the great insight displayed into the male behavior. Then I read the back cover and saw her photo. I could not believe how great a writer she is for her first novel. Can't wait for the next." The next review is from Mr. McKinney, who says, "Great book from a true professional and expert. I've been a fan of Jerri's podcast for several months. Her wonderful interviews and enthusiasm for crime fiction and nonfiction forced me to buy her book. I have not been disappointed. Pay to Play was a wonderful book that delivered on exactly what you want from a crime fiction novel. I anxiously await the next book and more episodes from her podcast." And then the last one that I received since we last spoke is from T. Smith. And T. Smith says, "I enjoyed the author's podcast, loved her book. Fantastic. I don't get a lot of time to read, and so I was always anxious to get back to the story at the end of my day. Great writing, character, and plot development. Jerri Williams is an up-and-coming fiction crime writer without a doubt. I will buy her future titles for sure." Wow. Thank you, Pat, Mr. McKinney, and T. Smith. I want to thank everyone who has gone out and picked up a copy of Pay to Play, and I especially want to thank those of you who have given it such fantastic reviews. Good reviews help other readers find good books, so I really appreciate that. I do have a great crime novel to recommend to you today, and I'll talk to you more about it after the interview. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, Myron Fuller. Hi, Myron.
Hi, Jerri.
So glad to have you with us today. I spent most of my career working economic crime, and so to talk to somebody who was at the very forefront of the FBI's work with advanced fee schemes and other types of cons is absolutely fascinating.
I was very proud to be a part of a group of people that 30, 40 years ago saw that this was a major crime problem that needed to be addressed.
All right, so we're talking back in 1976 and 1977. At that time, who was working these big international financial fraud type cases?
I don't think there was much going on in the FBI with that. The U.S. Customs Agency was working that, and I was introduced to a U.S. Customs agent by a senior agent on our squad there in New York, and he was the one who kind of, gave us information and had an informant who was monitoring these type of criminal activities. So that was my entree into the globalization of con schemes.
And could you tell us a little bit more about that global con game?
Yeah, it's when con men who have expertise in economic crimes with banks and transfers and insurance companies that saw an opportunity to use offshore banks, setting up really banks in other parts of the world, mostly in offshore, so they can't be reached, but in Europe as well, where they could have someone to back them up.
And what type of cons were they doing? How were they getting people's money, and who were those victims?
Well, as you know, con men flourish when the economy is bad. And the 70s, starting in the early 70s and going forward, the economy was pretty bad, and con men saw this as an opportunity. In fact, there was an international con gathering in Dallas in 1976, in July of 1976, where they traded ideas on how to pull these scams off, because people needed money and they couldn't get it through what was traditionally the way to do it, go to a bank or a savings and loan that had shut down pretty much on giving those loans. So they were desperate, and this is what con men seek, is desperation.
So when they had this big meeting, did authorities know about it? I mean, were we watching the place? Were we finding out, what they were doing? Or was all of this done in the shadows without anybody knowing that these con men were getting together?
I don't think anybody in law enforcement knew anything about this, because I don't think they were paying attention to these people. I learned about it when we started monitoring Fred Pro and Cy Guthrie.
When you say we, exactly who is conducting this investigation of white-collar crime criminals?
That's a very good question, because there is a much broader explanation to what we saw and found out with the Fred Pro and Cy Guthrie operation. That was actually provided to us in New York by Operation Fountain Pen, or OPFO Pen as it's codenamed, which was put together by James Weddick and Jack Brennan out of the Indianapolis Division to penetrate white-collar crime con men.
That's interesting, because I actually interviewed Jim Weddick about Operation Fountain Pen in episode 6. So if anybody wants to look at the connection between ABSCAM and Operation Fountain Pen, they can go back and listen to that episode.
The FBI had only been in the business of investigating under the white-collar crime program for only a couple of years. I think it was 1976 when it initiated that the FBI would be investigating white-collar crime. So Jim Weddick and Jack Brennan wasted no time in going undercover to penetrate the international con men that were a threat to the financial institutions in the United States. So that's how we got going, and they brought Phil Kitzer to New York. Phil Kitzer introduced Jack Brennan and Jim Weddick to Fred Pro and Cy Guthrie, and then came over to our office there in New York City and said, here, this is something you can go with. That's how that got together and got started.
So that means that ABSCAM was actually a spinoff of this Operation Fountain Pen.
Absolutely. ABSCAM would have never occurred had Operation Fountain Pen had not come to New York City. We would have not known about Fred Pro. We would have not known about Mel Weinberg. We would have not known about Cy Guthrie. It was a direct spinoff into the first case was called the Brookhaven Servicing Corporation, but that was later changed to code name of ABSCAM.
Okay, so while Jim Weddick and Jack Brennan were off with Phil Kitzer, that's when you and your partner began looking at Fred Pro and Cy Guthrie.
Cy Guthrie was a major player with organized crime as well as con schemes. He was a graduate of St. Mary's in San Antonio, Texas, and he was a very smart guy. He knew how to bank, and he told me several times. He said, organized crime needs me. And I said, why? He says, because they can't go into a bank and talk turkey with them. He says, I can't. He knew that in order to hide the transaction as much as possible, they'd have to go set up a bank in the Caribbean or overseas somewhere. So this is what they talked about at this big meeting in Dallas.
So organized crime families were using these con men as their money launderers?
Well, they were using them as an expertise front. They wanted to get involved. There were three things that organized crime wanted back then that they didn't have. One was a bank, another was an insurance company, and the third was contracts with the federal government.
Organized crime wanted contracts with the federal government?
Yes. Cy Guthrie started out in the agricultural area. Back then, the federal government was controlling the price of milk, for example, and they would buy you out. They would pay you not to milk your cows. So Cy Guthrie, in Louisiana, went in and bought some land there in Louisiana and set up a sham, milk production program, a situation where actually he had people that would loan him, lease him cows so he could say that they were his cows. And then you go to the federal government and say, I have all these cows. I understand that you were paying us, not to milk them, and sign a contract, and that's what they did.
So he got money for not melting cows that he didn't have.
That's right.
That's a good con.
Another thing they were about to get involved in New York City was the Lucchese crime family was going to be the straw front. Or if you don't know if you don't recall this maybe, but Jimmy Carter was going to rebuild the Bronx, and it was so dilapidated, and it was really gone. So he wanted to rebuild it as a showing that here's what I can do as president. I can actually rebuild a city and make it work. Well, he didn't get it through, but it was all set up. The Lucchese family had already set up about 5 or 10 straw contractors, and they were going to control them all.
Wow. So organized crime, had their hands in various businesses, and they wanted to branch out and have their hands and fingers and toes and elbows in every business that they could possibly get a piece of.
You're right. And one of the first things that Pro did when he got to New York, he was asked by organized crime to front for him to take over Iverson Cycle Company, which made bicycles for Sears at the time. They were in trouble, and the organized crime wanted to buy it. They couldn't do it, so they went to Pro, and he helped them set up buying it out, and it was about a $40 million fraud.
So tell us a little bit more about Fred Pro. So he is one of these con men that have been involved in international schemes.
Yeah, Fred was very experienced in contracts. He had a legitimate job with the Pennsylvania Transit company, Pennsylvania Transit, I guess it's called, the transportation company of Pennsylvania, which I think was focused mostly in Philadelphia with the subways and the trains all there.
That's where he learned his expertise in contracts.
Yes, and then he went on to work in contracts with General Electric and one other major energy and defense contractor out in Long Island. So
why would he want to get involved with organized crime?
Well, because he wanted to get involved in business, period, and he did on his own. I think it was kind of a natural meeting of the minds when you have a con man and an organized crime figure, both kind of looking at the same things. And they cross each other, and organized crime needed him for its expertise, and he needed organized crime to protect them, for protection.
Okay, so if he pulled a con on somebody that wasn't happy about it, then, he didn't have to worry because organized crime had its back.
Right.
And Fred Pro became one of your informants or cooperating witnesses.
He did eventually after he actually was threatened with, they were going to throw him out the window there in Manhattan, but he called me one night and said he had to get out of town and that he would call me sometime later. So he left and went underground for a year, but eventually he got back in 79 and we started putting these cases away. Yeah, he knew me because we had conducted the Title III his apartment building. We also had a microphone in his office, and we ran that for about a month, and then we conducted a search warrant on his place. So he knew what we had. He knew that all of his documents and everything of fraud were going to be reviewed. So he knew it was up. So he pretty much immediately started cooperating with us and setting up a sting operation in his apartment there in Manhattan. Directed organized crime and some of the con men that he already had a relationship with. By the way, he was going to be the original source in the ABSCAM operation. But because he left town and Mel didn't go to jail, it's kind of well, if we don't have this one, we've got that one. Mel turned out to be really good, of course, but we thought Mel was going to jail. And then we thought Fred would work with us, but then he got caught up owing too many people too much money, and so we had to get out of town. But no, Fred was one of those, I think, opportunities that you watch TV and think, man, I wish I could have somebody who could be in this part of the world that would be my eyes and ears and help me get in between organized crime and legitimate business. And this is what Fred offered to us. We knew we had a good case. We knew we had an opportunity that at least no one in New York had ever done. The organized crime program in New York was set up by squad. There were about 7 or 8 squads, and there was one squad for each of the 5 family, and I think Gambino actually had 2 squads. They didn't have anything going like this at all. All they had going was the illegal gambling and truck hijacking. Those were the 2 things that kept them busy.
Was it difficult for you to convince headquarters to take on a case like this?
Not as much as I thought. I was fortunate that there was a supervisor down there, maybe it was a unit chief, I believe, down in the old economic, I don't know what they even called it back then. It was the unit that handled 87 violations, which, as you know, was a number of classifications that were under that one class 187 number. When I went down to headquarters and started talking to him, he was a very experienced guy, and he understood. He had served in New York, so he knew that we had a good thing, and he was the one. He didn't put any stops on us at all. He just said, well, first of all, yes, I'll support you, and secondly, you need to go over to the Department of Justice and run this by them so that they can approve your Title III and all of that. So it wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be.
Interesting. Through this case, you're able to develop Fred Pro as your cooperator. Now he has to get out of town because his life is being threatened. And that's when you decide to switch to Mel Weinberg. Tell us a little bit more about Mel Weinberg.
Mel Weinberg came to our attention through the Title III. We had many, many conversations of him talking to Fred Pro, and it was mainly about, although he had done some other deals using some of these other schemes, but the main one that he was interested in at that time, because Joe Trocchio was interested, and Joe Trocchio and Mel were very close. The conversation that we picked up on was the Joe Trocchio's efforts to try to purchase a mortgage company out there in Long Island called Brookhaven Servicing Corporation. It handled about $150 million volume of mortgages. For him, an organized crime, that would have been a great vehicle for them to have a lot of money available to them at all times. For example, people who pay their mortgages early before they are due, all that money becomes float money, and at any given time there was around $10 million float money available for whatever they wanted to use it for. Chase Manhattan Bank owned Brookhaven Servicing Corporation. Okay.
That's the mortgage company.
Yeah, and they wanted to sell it. They wanted to sell that, and they also had owned a Community National Bank in Brooklyn that they wanted to sell as well, and we were talking about buying that one as well. But Brookhaven was the hot one.
So you have these con men who are not just doing deals for themselves, but they're also in partnership with organized crime. Tell us now how ABSCAM came about, because initially it was not supposed to be a public corruption case.
Correct. We were looking at all the people, organized crime and con men that we saw gathering around Fred Pro. And Mel Weinberg, by the way, had quite a deep relationship with organized crime himself. Although he was pretty smart about it, he didn't get too deep with them that he couldn't get out. But he had friendship with some, more than we thought at first. But as time went on, we realized that he really did have a deep relationship. But he didn't really want to go after organized crime that much, although he wanted to help us get in between organized crime and the purchase of this mortgage company. So he was all in for that. I'd never worked undercover before, so I really didn't plan on it, but we decided to open a separate case. From the Fred Pro case, we opened a separate case on the Brookhaven Servicing Corporation. And we put the title, Joe Trocchio, Fred Pro, and Richard Sparrow, who was the mob attorney. Joe Trocchio was a well-known organized crime figure in the Colombo family. He had beaten a couple of raps. One of them was he was charged with stealing, along with some other guys, $20-30 million in treasury bills. There was a lot of that going on out of Wall Street. But 3 of the people who were going to testify against him were killed. So, yeah,
there goes the case.
Yeah, he was pretty deep, and he was also very close to some of the people who pulled off the Lufthansa heist that you might have read about or heard about out in Long Island. You know the movie The Goodfellas?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, a lot of those people that were knocked out, remember how they started knocking everybody off toward the end?
Yes.
Those were real knockoffs, and those were friends of Joe Trocchio. I mean, that's how close he was to those people.
When you say that Mel Weinberg didn't necessarily want to go after organized crime, was that because he was truly friends with them, or because he knew that's not a good thing to do?
Yeah, he was walking a fine line. He was willing to help us get Joe Trocchio. I think he saw Joe as kind of limping on one leg, and he's getting pretty old, and maybe, he would be able to work around that. But he had some other organized crime friends that he was not going to go after. He didn't point us in those directions at all. But we didn't argue with that, because we were happy that he was there to help us make the case.
Was the initial sting to have an Arab? Now, everybody says it was an Arab sheik, but who exactly was this person supposed to be, and who designed that aspect of the case? Okay.
Well, we got lucky, I guess, and you know how that works. When the Fred Pro case, we finally did a search warrant and brought in all of his documents. It filled up an entire room. Was able to get John Hauss, who was an agent that worked, because he was the one who introduced me to U.S. Customs guy. So he was good. He was about 15 years my senior or so, and he was my mentor. Okay, so he was helping me on this, and he worked undercover with me with Mel against Trocchio there for a while. I told him one day, I said, "Look, I'm way over my head on this. I can't handle all this." And he said, "Well, let me go with you to the supervisor and see if we can get some help." So we did. We got 5 additional agents to work. Some of them were on the squad, some of them were not. But we got 5 additional agents to work full time just on the Fred Pro case. So now I had some time. I could work with Mel. One of the agents that was helping was a guy named Charlie Mandigo. Charlie Mandigo was a fairly new agent, but he was working hard, and one of the leads he had was with a vice president at Chase Manhattan Bank. So he came back after that meeting with the guy. He said, you should talk to this guy, because he's the former CIA or Army Intelligence or whatever, but he has a lot of connections in Africa and the Middle East. And I said, okay. He knew that we were already talking about a scenario. Now, Fred Pro had tried to use the Arab prop, and Mel had actually tried to use the Arab prop too. So it was not there was not an unknown prop that con men were trying to use. They saw what I saw, and I remember reading the New York Times, one of the Sunday edition of New York Times, that a big essay on how the Arabs were buying up America, in the sense that they were buying up banks, they were buying up treasury notes, they were buying golf courses, they were buying a lot of stuff, kind of like the Japanese did a few years later. So it was kind of, the picture was coming and focused that the Arabs were coming to America, and the con men saw this right away as a prop. Fred Pro saw it, Mel saw it. So it was kind of like, this is where we're going with this. I went over and talked to this banker, and I said, look, I can't tell you the details of what we're doing, but here's what we have. We have an opportunity. He said, do you mind if I help you? I said, of course not. He said, I will help you. I will give you a portfolio on a real Arab. He's from United Arab Emirates, Ras Al Khaimah, which is one of the 7 United Arab Emirates over there. And he said, I can give you a copy of his passport. I can give you a copy of other things about him. And he says, we'll set up a portfolio in the bank here for you. He will be your guy. He will be the person that's backing you with his money. I said, but does this person really exist? He said, yes, but he said, don't worry. He said, don't worry about it. We're not going to get him involved. He will never know. We did find out later there really was a person with the same name. He gave me all these documents, and he had a letter from an ambassador in Lebanon, and the letter was dated April 1st for some kind of April foolishness, I guess. But in 1976, but he was later assassinated. So Mike Elvey knew that he would never come back to haunt us because he'd been assassinated, so we could use his name. But it was simply a letter to me from him congratulating me on becoming connected with Kambir Abdul Rahman. So that's kind of the background of how this got going, that we thought, we could use the Arab as a backstop, as a prop. From there on, of course, that's what we did, and it went a lot further than we thought. But that was the beginning of it. We decided we had to get somebody who could speak the language. We came up with a Lebanese guy in Cleveland who had he didn't have any connection with any of the investigations other than he was Arabic and could speak the language. And he was used very sparingly. This guy was really not, the aura of the Arab was what was important, not the Arab himself.
Right. Yeah, just saying that there was this Arab guy, you didn't need to pull him out like a dog and pony show, I guess. Now, when you said that you worked undercover, what was your role? Were you playing a con man or a victim, or?
I was playing a dirty banker who had been fired from Chase Manhattan Bank for stealing money, but they didn't want to prosecute me, they didn't want the attention. But I was playing the person who worked directly for the Arab and was controlling on where he would spend his money.
When we talk about ABSCAM, most people associate ABSCAM with a movie that came out just a few years back, and that's American Hustle.
Right. So
as we move on with this story, how much was portrayed correctly in American Hustle? And American Hustle, the big-time movie with Bradley Cooper and with Christian Bale. And I understand that you were consulted. You actually sat down with Christian Bale, and tell us about that.
Yeah, I spent a whole weekend with Christian Bale in his home in Beverly Hills, but Mel was there too. I mean, my purpose of being there was for two things. One is to keep Mel on track, and also to provide background. Parts of the movie that were real in the sense of what we really did was the banking. The bank at Chase Manhattan Bank. Without the bank prop, I don't think we would have gotten to first base. Because we would use the reference, hey, we have money. I was talking to headquarters. I said, I'm going to need money to put in my undercover account at Chase Manhattan Bank. And he said, well, how much do you need? I said, well, they're telling us that they need $2.2 million as upfront money just to open negotiations to purchase the bank. Got a mortgage company with it. And I said, but we probably need more than that. Maybe throw in another $1 million just to make it look good. He said, okay, so $3.2 million. I said, yeah. He said, He said, I'll support you on that. So they did. They sent up to $3.2 million and went into my undercover name account at Chase Manhattan Bank, and it was managed by another person in the bank who knew nothing about, the FBI being involved at all.
In this movie, Christian Bale plays a role that is supposed to be Mel Weinberg.
Correct.
Tell me about the first time that you actually started talking about this Arab, and what was he?
He was a construction. He had a construction business in the Middle East, and he had contracts, throughout the Middle East. He was making money not directly from oil, but from the building that was, there was a massive building going on in the Middle East at that time.
All right, so you decided to set up this scam, not using him, but using his persona to move you forward.
Right, correct. And our ploy was that we have the backing. We can help you buy this mortgage company. And Richard Sparrow, who was the attorney representing the mob and representing Tropium, was the spokesperson. And he and I went over and sat down with the attorneys for Chase Manhattan Bank. At that time, Chase Manhattan Bank was using the most prestigious law firm in Manhattan at the time. So we sat down in the law firm offices and talked about what we wanted to do, and they wanted to know where the money is coming from. And I told them. John Hauss was a very articulate, speaking about it, and he had more experience than I did. But
he was also playing an undercover role.
Yeah, John Hauss, myself. His name was Hans Pfizer, and my name was Myron Wagner. So I think that's when it occurred to me. It kind of hit me right as we were walking out down the street, and I remember talking to John, and I said, John, you realize what we just did? He said, yeah. I said, we just talked to the attorneys who, for Chase Manhattan Bank, who wanted to sell a mortgage company. Well, that's what we wanted to focus on. And we negotiated with them, and all they wanted to know was how you're going to pay for it. And we told them, and we walked out, and they said, okay, well, then the next step would be you guys, send us your request on how you're going to do this, and we'll go from there. John and I both knew we couldn't go forward, but we took it far enough that now we had a conspiracy, and Southern District of New York actually prosecuted this case as a RICO conspiracy, the first ever known that anyone prosecuted a case for RICO conspiracy. But that's what they prosecuted it under. And they were all convicted. This was the first case that we made with the ABSCAM scenario, but it was the last one that was prosecuted because we couldn't prosecute it until all the other cases were adjudicated.
And the scheme was that you were undercover but acting as middlemen to purchase the mortgage company for organized crime.
Exactly. Yeah.
So then how did ABSCAM turn to public corruption? How did that happen? Was that intentional, or was that just next thing you knew, some greedy politician had his hands out?
It was kind of it was accidental. There's another term for that, but I can't remember what it is. But Mel was friends with a con man who was in with some New Jersey politicians, and one of them was the mayor of Camden. He knew him, and he knew that the mayor of Camden was looking for some financial support to do things as mayors, whatever mayors do. And he said, he told Mel, he says, this mayor is dirty. He'll take a bribe. So Mel called me and said, it was a Saturday. I was at home in New Jersey. We lived in Glen Rock, New Jersey. And he called me and he says, I have this opportunity to meet with this con man about the mayor Angelo Arrighetti. And that's what American Hustle was all about, this one deal. He said, I have an opportunity to meet this con man who says the mayor is dirty. Should I meet with him? And I said, absolutely, go meet with him. He says, can you come with me? And I said, no. I said, you go ahead and meet with him and get back to me. And he did. And he came back to me and he says, he'll introduce us to Angelo Arrighetti, the mayor of Camden. I said, okay. So that was the door opening to political figures and corruption and politics. That's how it got going.
So how many politicians ended up being taken down by this case?
There were 6 congressmen, including the senator of New Jersey, Harrison Williams. There was the Angelo Arigatti. There was a couple of councilmen there in Philadelphia. There was the New Jersey Gaming Commissioner. They just set up gambling in southern New Jersey back then. He was also convicted. And there was also a regional director for INS, Immigration National Service. He was also, I think he was like a grade 15 or something in the federal government. About 10 major political figures that went down.
And what was the connection to this Arab businessman for all of them? What was he supposed to do for them? Why were they willing to take a bribe and to allow him to do whatever it was he wanted to do?
What the Arab scenario offered was money, and it also offered opportunities. If I want to do business, for example, Harrison Williams wanted to help develop a mining operation down in southern New Jersey. So that was an opportunity for the Arab to say, okay, I'll help you on your mine, give you some money to help you develop this mine. If you'll help me develop business in America. You know, you help me use your power as senator to help the Arab gain a foothold in business in the United States. So that was the quid pro quo. At this point in time, I worked undercover on the Brookhaven matter, and I worked undercover on 6 other cases that were prosecuted. But when it came to the getting into the politicians, I had to make a big decision. I also had the pro case in front of me. I had all these cases that I had to see through and get prosecuted. So I had to make a decision to either move to Long Island from New Jersey. I was driving every day from my house in northern New Jersey to Mel's place out in Long Island. It was about almost 100 miles, one way. I was just burning down. And it was either move to Long Island and become totally involved and become the case agent, undercover agent rather, on all of these. But I thought, I knew where we were. We were already at Mayor Arigatti, and we were already in touch with Harrison Williams people. But to me, it was like, okay, I can do that, but then I have to give up all these other things that I have going. So I chose. Plus, there was one other aspect to this. I had been told that I was up for promotion to maybe get a supervisor's desk there in Manhattan, in New York. And now I was pushing like 10 years in the Bureau. So I was ready to make some changes if the opportunity was there. So I gave up my undercover role in the politicians part of it. But I maintained my undercover role in other cases. And that's when they brought in Tony Amoroso, who had been in New York and was now assigned to one of the units down at headquarters. And they brought him back up to New York to work as the undercover agent against the whatever politicians that they might encounter.
Okay, so at that point, the case kind of split. So let's talk about the successes that you had with the part that you remained with, the ones having to do directly with the con men and organized crime. What type of success did you see in those areas?
I made 5 different purchases of stolen securities from organized crime figures. And I had undercover meetings with an individual with the name of Sonny Santini. Sonny Santini was, I'm not sure what organized crime family he was closest attached to, but I think it was the Gambino family for the most part. But he was a gangster. There was no doubt about that. And he was a dangerous gangster. He also had some schemes going on in Las Vegas. And I went to Las Vegas and I visited him there in an undercover capacity. And I was introduced to the owners of the Aladdin Hotel. They were owned by the mob out of Detroit and also out of Kansas City. There was a pension fund, a union pension fund. It was controlled pretty much by organized crime. And I was introduced to the owners of the Aladdin Hotel to see if I could help them, save their hotel with using Arab money. I was also introduced to the owner of the Circus Casino. I was also introduced to the Sands Hotel and the Dunes Hotel. So I spent quite a time there being introduced to casinos who were looking for money, anywhere. Arab money, they didn't care where it came from. Now, the Aladdin Hotel, not because of what I did, but it eventually was taken over by the federal government. It was forfeited. But some of these other places, I just really didn't have the time to explore that, and I couldn't get any. The FBI office in Las Vegas had no interest in this whatsoever. What it did do is I saw through the other cases, and I would say there's a total of about, out of those 5 or 6 or 7 cases, there were maybe 35 defendants in all. And I know the Santini case had 5 people. They were all convicted. And interestingly, the Santini appealed his conviction to the circuit court, and the circuit court upheld our the conviction. Right. And we had a letter anonymous letter from an associate of Santini during this time, saying that Santini was saying that if he didn't win his appeal case, that people involved with the prosecution of him were going to be sorry, to that effect. So he put that in the letter. Well, after the case was adjudicated and Santini went to jail, this was about a year later, the prosecuting attorney, Dwight Green, was the one who prosecuted that case, and he was very aggressive. And he went after Santini, and he went after that guy named Richard Strom, who was also had offered me stolen securities. He went after these guys with a vengeance. He won the case. He won the appeal. But Dwight Green was brutally murdered in his own house.
Wow. The prosecutor?
Yes.
Were you able to tie that back to Santini?
No, by that time I had been transferred. I'd been promoted down to Shreveport, Louisiana as the SSRA. So I was down there, knee deep in alligators down there too. But to me it was circumstantial, but we know that plausibly Santini would have done that, or would have had it done if he could.
And was the murder ever solved, as far as you know?
It was never solved. Nope.
So one of the things I'd like to kind of wrap everything up with is your obvious relationship to this day with your informant, Mel Weinberg. So right. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, Mel is Jewish, and I was Protestant Baptist from Arkansas. So we had a little bit different backgrounds to start with. When Mel came forward to offer his cooperation, it was really he was motivated by 2 things. One, to keep his girlfriend out of jail, his mistress. He was married, but he also had a mistress. And to keep her.
So that was kind of similar. That was kind of similar to what they showed in the movie.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that did come through. Plus, he wanted to keep himself out of jail. So that was his motivation to cooperate. And he had been prosecuted by the FBI and U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh for defrauding a elderly lady, widow out there. And so he knew he was going to go down for that. He wasn't going to be able to beat it. And so I went out there, and they had invited Miami, because Mel had done a lot of business in Miami. They invited, I think, 5 or 6 other offices that they thought might have an interest. And they all shook their head and said no. They didn't want to have anything to do with Mel Weinberg. They saw him as the greedy, slick, untrustworthy con man. So I said, look, he's in my backyard. I'm going to take a chance with him. So that's how that got going. So we had to meet. We had several meetings. We'd go to lunch out there in Long Island, and we'd talk. And so I think he warmed up to me, and over time, we became very close. The bottom line is on that is I trusted Mel back then more than I trusted some of the other people involved in this. So that's how close we were.
Wow.
I last saw Mel last year. I think, got what month it was myself. I introduced him to the guy that's writing the book. Are you familiar with what Weddick and Bennett are doing with the book?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. So I'm aware that Weddick and Brennan are working with writer David Howard. They have a book that's coming out this year called Chasing Phil, and it's all about their escapades with Phil Kitzer and Operation Fountain Pen. And it's optioned for a film with Warner Brothers that looks like it's actually going to get made.
Okay, well, I introduced that writer to Mel because he wanted to talk to him. And we spent 3 or 4 days together down there. And we still talk on the phone occasionally. He calls me or I'll call him. He's now around 90, I guess, 91 or 92, but still going.
Were you in contact with him throughout the time that he first became your cooperating witness informant in the late 70s until present?
Yeah, he went to work for Louis Vuitton, after ABSCAM. So sometime during the 80s, mid-80s or so, he was hired by Louis Vuitton out of Paris to be their global security guy. So
really?
Yeah.
They pick a former conman to be their global security guy.
Yeah, and so he came to Dallas back in like 1990.
Oh, you gotta explain that. How did he become a global security expert?
Well, I guess Louis Vuitton saw that Mel knew a crook when he and that Mel had testified on behalf of the U.S. government against politicians. I mean, that's a pretty strong statement. It's a pretty strong resume. And I think they looked at him as someone who's a very powerful individual who's willing to go after anybody. So they also knew that their losses were mostly the people making these like the Korean
knockoffs.
Yeah, knockoffs. Yeah, that's what their problem was. So they figured he could handle that, and he did. So he came to Dallas, and my wife had worked for the FBI back in Chicago, and then she worked for the FBI in New York City as well. Then we started having a family, and she never went back. But she had met Mel, and she became very familiar with Mel because Mel, being Jewish, didn't celebrate Christmas, but he always called me on those days. So, it was like Christmas Day, and Dawn says, well, I wonder if Mel will call this year. So she got to know him, and when he was preparing for testimony against some of the politicians down in Miami, I was asked to go down and spend a couple of weeks with him just to babysit him, to keep him out of trouble. But she went with me, and so she knew Mel well, and we'd gone out to dinner with him. So when he came to Dallas, we went out to dinner with him, and he asked Dawn, says, what are you doing? And she said, well, I'm not doing anything right now. She said, would you like a job? And she said, sure. So she became an investigator for Mel.
Wow.
She went several places in the United States. She went to Canada. She went to Mexico. She went down to the Caribbean. She worked for him for a couple of years until we got transferred back here to Utah. So that was another way that we stayed in touch with him. And then as time went on, when I was in Hawaii, he would call because he had done some business in Hawaii, and he knew the organized crime guy out there. And Mel is a never-ending energy. He just goes on and on and on. It's incredible how much energy he had.
Did he ever get convicted? Did he ever spend any time in jail?
He was convicted in the Pittsburgh case, but because of what he did and my going out to the judge and telling him, look, we would never have been able to make this case without Mel. And so the judge gave him probation. So he was convicted, but he never went to jail.
Initially you have this Operation Fountain Pen case with all of these con men and organized crime figures and all of these different spinoff cases. Do you know how many spinoff cases you had in total?
I know that the 5 people that helped me put all the cases together for Fred Pro, I know that there was 100, a little over 100. There was 101 deals that were prosecutable that he put together. I know that from the Title III, we came up with endless numbers of phone numbers of individuals, and then we would select, we'd get the toll records or the call records for selected numbers that looked like they were organized crime. So there was no end. There was just endless numbers of phone numbers that we were following. And what happened was when we moved down to, just before we moved from the office from 3rd Avenue and 69th Street down to the Federal Building in Lower Manhattan, they decided that they would create a new squad just for intelligence purposes, to to have an intelligence base that would produce cases, because what they saw was what we did with Pro and Mel Weinberg, that we really didn't, none of these were walk-in complaints. Nobody ever come into the FBI and said, hey, I got a complaint against Sandy Santini. That didn't happen. What they saw was the value of intelligence. And so they set up a squad, called it M1, and it's basically surrounded all the things that we had put together with from Oppo Pen to Fred Pro and ABSCAM and all those spin-off cases. Yeah. It was a wonderful break for me to be where I was at the time in New York. I had become very eager to do something, but I didn't know what it was going to be. But I think John Hauss, my mentor, was an attorney and a guy who was very solid, and he said, these are things that the FBI should be doing, and then looking at what was being done by other agencies, we weren't stepping up, and now we had an opportunity to do that. The only thing that maybe I would do different is that when we had all of these props that were, just unbelievable successful, these props, this banking connection, the money, the arrow, we had an opportunity to go through any door almost that you could think of, casinos, wherever organized crime existed. We had introductions to get there. So what I would do different, not that it wasn't a good thing to catch these politicians, with their hands out, but politicians still do the same thing. They just now call it lobbying. So we haven't really solved that case. I mean, corruption by way of politicians, I think the corruption is still there. But I think that the impact that we could have made bigger and better would have been following organized crime, through other doors that they were involved in. That's where I think the impact, a bigger impact, more lasting impact could have been made.
Well, in addition to this huge case that has now a place in history, everybody knows about ABSCAM, but from this particular case, I know you had other successes, and you ended up your career as the special agent in charge of the Honolulu Division. Yeah, that was another. It was kind of crazy how I wound up. I was on the inspection staff, and I was asked to do an inspection. And if you recall, a terrorism issue with the FBI really didn't get hot until after they attacked. Remember the first time in '93 when they attacked the World Trade Center? After that, things started to be a concern about that we may be attacked, by terrorists from other parts of the world. And they were looking at how well suited are we as a agency to conduct terrorist investigations or carry out counterterrorism investigations in other parts of the world. I mean, we really hadn't done it. What we had done in the past, as you know, mostly was the bomb tech guys would go over and do analysis of a bomb that went off in Lebanon or somewhere else or in Saudi Arabia, and then they'd come back home, and that would be kind of the end of it. So they started to look and asked the inspection division to take a look around the world as to what is the capability of the FBI to initiate and conduct terrorism investigations in other parts of the world. Well, I did this for the Asia Pacific. I think at that time there were 7 legal attaches in the embassies in the Asia Pacific, from Honolulu to Mongolia to India to Australia and back to Honolulu. So it's like 42 countries that were covered by 7 legats. But what I found was that the legats, I don't know if you ever served as the legat or not, but the legats really don't have any authority. And they're limited as to what they can do. They're really there at the behest of the ambassador, and they depend upon their contact with local law enforcement and intelligence agencies, and sometimes military, to do the work for them. So they really don't have the ability to go out and conduct an investigation. In fact, CIA really discounted the FBI as part of their partnership
that I ran into, at least in the Asia Pacific. CIA kind of discounted the FBI there as being a partner, and they refused to cooperate with them. They would only cooperate with someone from headquarters at the level of assistant director.
Wow.
So I went over, I talked to the ambassadors, I talked to CIA, I talked to anybody else I could. I wrote a report, and I come back and I said, I told Director Free, the FBI does not have the capability to do much with one legal attaché, say in Hong Kong, who covered also India and Pakistan. I said, there's just no way that Ligat has the authority or the time or the capability of doing anything. I said, we need to have a squad that will be operational. So we need an operational squad. And I say for the Asia Pacific, I think it should be in Honolulu, not Seattle, not LA, not San Francisco, but it should be in Honolulu, because Honolulu has all the infrastructure that was set up after World War II to have connections throughout the Asia Pacific. That's where the Pacific Command is in Honolulu. I said, so it all makes sense. So I wrote this report and recommended that's what you do. So he comes back and he says, okay, I agree with that. He said, by the way, the SAC spot in Honolulu is going to come open. Would you be interested in that? So I had to think about that. I didn't really think about it. So I called my wife, and I called an agent, SAC who had served in Honolulu. And I asked him about it. He said, go, just go. Just take my word for it, go. So I did. I went out, and I was told by assistant director who at that time covered all the counterterrorism matters. He said, go out there and make friends with everybody you can, as far as you can go. He says, I'll support your travel budget. Just go out there and, put together a program. And if a terrorist event occurs, take your squad, send your squad to it. He said, get it going. Just start generating some activity. So that was a great opportunity, and that's what we did. Word got around, that the FBI was finally doing something, and they wanted to know what it was we were doing. But I had to tell them that we're limited with resources. We can't just have an FBI agent just for terrorism matters in every embassy. It wasn't there. It wasn't going to happen. I spent a lot of time in Pakistan when they were committing nearly all of the terrorist acts against the United States from the early 90s to 2001 to 9/11 were all out of Pakistan. We could see this coming. We could see it brewing. We knew it was coming. And I would go back to headquarters and ask for additional help. It was fun. It was interesting, but it was very frustrating. And I have to say, when 9/11 occurred, I had just left the Bureau. I was pretty sick about it because I knew that we had missed it, that we had missed it again.
And that's the end of the interview. As always, back at jerriwilliams.com, you'll find photos of Myron Fuller, an FBI overview, and newspaper articles about the ABSCAM investigation. If you enjoyed the episode, I hope you share it with your friends, family, and associates. I make it easy for you. At the bottom of this episode's show notes at jerriwilliams.com, you'll find all of the social media share buttons. My crime fiction recommendation for you is Finders Keepers by Stephen King. And no, this is not a horror novel. Stephen King actually wrote a 3-book crime novel series. The first book was Mr. Mercedes, which I read before I started this podcast, but I highly recommend that one too. But the one that I read this month, Finders Keepers, was, I thought anyway, even better than Mr. Mercedes. You don't have to read them in order, but you would probably get a better understanding of some of the things that happen in the second book if you read Mr. Mercedes first. Finders Keepers is similar to Misery in that it features a devoted but demented fan of a famous best-selling novelist. But in this case, and I'm not ruining anything because it happens in the very first chapter, the demented fan doesn't just torture and make the novelist's life a living hell. He actually kills the novelist. He is angry that the 3-part series that the novelist wrote did not end the way that he thought it should. The rest of the book is all about what happens when the fan discovers that the novelist actually did write 2 more books, and everything that he goes through and the people around him go through as he continues his obsession with these unpublished manuscripts, which he is, quote unquote, dying to read. It's an excellent book. I love Stephen King. I love his writing, and the fact that he's now writing crime fiction is fabulous. And so my crime fiction recommendation for this week is Finders Keepers by Stephen King. And while you're checking that book out, please consider checking out Pay to Play by Jerri Williams. I also want to remind you to stop by jerriwilliams.com and sign up for my True Crime Fiction newsletter, which comes out once a month, contains all of the links to the podcast episodes, book recommendations, news articles about the FBI in books, TV, and movies, and other articles featuring the FBI in the news. This episode was sponsored by FBIRetired.com, the only online directory made available to the general public featuring retired FBI agents and analysts interested in showcasing their skills to secure business opportunities. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope you come back again for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerri Williams. Thank you.